Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through the gates of a crumbling castle hidden high in the misty hills of northern Hungary. Inside, the air smells like damp stone and something older, something metallic. The candles don't flicker here, they shiver, and as your footsteps echo through the cavernous halls, you feel the press of 1,000 untold stories stitched into the very walls. One of them is watching you. You've just arrived at Čachtice Castle, once the grand estate of Countess Elizabeth Bathory, but it's not the opulence you notice first, it's the silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's hiding something. You pass a rusted iron door, then another. Behind one, a stain mars the stone floor, long dried, but oddly shaped. You wonder if it's wine. It's not wine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and current time in the comments. It's always fun to see where and when history is keeping people up at night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle past what might have once been a chapel, candles long since gone. A few faded symbols remain etched into the walls, one of them unmistakably Christian, the other, well, historians still argue whether it's a distorted family crest or something much older. You turn your head. Was that whispering? Elizabeth Bathory, yes. That Elizabeth doesn't come from some vague rumor or twisted fairy tale. She was very real. Born in 1560, a Hungarian noblewoman of staggering wealth and terrifying legend. Some call her the most prolific female serial killer in history. Others insist her crimes were political slander, concocted to take her land. The truth, somewhere in between. And tonight, you're going to walk every step of it. Here's what's odd for all the tales of virgins drained and bathtubs brimming with blood. Elizabeth herself looks surprisingly ordinary. Portraits show a pale, narrow face, arched brows, and tight lips. Regal, maybe. Haunted, definitely. You wonder what those eyes saw, or did. A lot of the horror starts in these walls. Čachtice wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, a prison, and depending on who you ask, a torture chamber thinly disguised as a castle. But it didn't start that way. It starts quiet. It always does. In the daylight, Čachtice is beautiful. Rolling hills, a vineyard, birds, the occasional goat. Confused but happy, visitors snap selfies outside, unaware that beneath their feet once lay secret passageways, iron cages, and what one 17th century cleric described as rooms blackened by human suffering. You take a tentative step into one such chamber, and your foot hits a groove in the floor, a drain, stone-carved, centuries old. Your flashlight catches scratches around it like claw marks, too deep for rats, too many to be a coincidence. In a small, recessed alcove, you find a wooden bucket. It's cracked. Inside, a smear of something dry and brown clings to the edge. Your brain offers a dozen rational explanations. You choose none of them. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth really bathed in blood. The claim emerged during her arrest in 1610, decades after the first alleged killing. One servant claimed to have seen her strike a girl so hard she bled, and when the blood touched her hand, Elizabeth thought her skin looked younger. Whether that actually happened or not, it stuck, and stuck hard. You pass through what was once a private chamber. A massive fireplace, a mirror, blackened with time, and a bed, if you can call it that. The mattress is long gone, but the iron frame is still there. Above it, a hook in the ceiling. You try not to think about why. Elizabeth's household was enormous. Dozens of servants, tutors, maids, and visitors filtered in and out. And yet, some never left. You begin to notice it in the architecture, a hallway that leads to a bricked-up wall, a staircase to nowhere, a small, iron-barred window that looks into what a hidden room. This wasn't a normal noblewoman's home. It was designed to conceal, to contain, to control. And as you wander deeper, something shifts. The air grows colder, not just temperature tone. You've crossed a threshold. This isn't just history anymore. This is memory, seeping through the stone, and it remembers. You pause near a window. The forest below sways gently in the night breeze. Somewhere, an owl calls. You half expect to hear a scream echoing in return. Elizabeth Bathory didn't become the Blood Countess overnight, but this castle is where the transformation happened. Slowly, secretly, and perhaps with more help than anyone dared admit. So, you keep walking, past rooms where girls once laughed, past hallways where their voices vanished, and in every creak, every draft, every shifting shadow, you begin to understand. This place was never meant to be lived in. It was built to be fed. You head deeper into the stone belly of the castle, where light gives up and the air turns syrup thick. A narrow passage coils to your left. You follow it, brushing past ancient mortar that flakes at your touch. It feels alive, breathing. And maybe that's not so surprising because the girl who grew up here, little Elizabeth, was born into a world already soaked in blood. Her family, the noble and notoriously inbred House of Bathory, ruled vast lands across what's now Hungary and Slovakia. Imagine being born into a family where everyone has titles, too much money, and a suspicious number of cousins who also happen to be siblings. You don't play with dolls, you watch real people die for disobedience. Elizabeth's uncle, historians note, was rumored to dabble in Satanism. Her aunt was fascinated with sexual cruelty. And her brother, well, he was known for throwing wild parties that often ended in torture. Think Game of Thrones, but with slightly worse hygiene. And Elizabeth, she was sharp, intelligent, multilingual. She learned Latin, German, and Hungarian before most kids today can spell their name without autocorrect. But brains weren't a barrier to brutality. If anything, they made her more precise. One legend, just a legend, maybe says she witnessed her first public execution at age 6. The victim was accused of theft, and the punishment sewn into a horse's belly while still alive. You wince. But you also notice something. This sort of cruelty wasn't unusual in her world. It was sanctioned, structured, routine. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's own seizures as a child, a condition likely caused by her family's inbreeding, fueled an obsession with pain. One surviving letter suggests she was treated by smearing the blood of a pure soul on her lips. So yeah, maybe the seed was already planted. She came of age in a time of war, plague, and paranoid religiosity. The Ottoman Empire lurked constantly on the horizon. Peasant revolts broke out like seasonal allergies. Witch trials were popular, and women were either saints, mothers, or threats to be burned. Guess which box Elizabeth didn't fit in? By age 10, she was promised to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman with more land than patience. He was older, ambitious, and deeply immersed in military campaigns against the Ottomans. Their engagement was as political as it was strategic. Love not really part of the deal, but power that was baked in. You step into what remains of the nursery. The air smells like dust and forgotten lullabies. A broken toy cart sits in the corner, its wheel long gone. The cradle is tiny, but your eyes fix on a darker spot along the stone wall, barely visible now. A crack, no, a name, scratched into the surface, clumsily. Maybe a servant, maybe a child. Either way, someone wanted to be remembered. Elizabeth married Ferenc when she was about 14. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, and guests brought gifts like falcons, gold goblets, and, according to one weirdly specific record, a bag of goat ears. Because nothing says best wishes like farm animal fragments. As part of the union, she moved into Castle Sarvar, one of the Nadasdi family homes. Farron spent most of his time fighting wars, leaving Elizabeth in charge of managing the estate. She had authority over servants, legal power over peasants, and access to torture tools supposedly designed for discipline. Handy, right. One particular story unverified. But Sticky describes Elizabeth punishing a disobedient servant girl by driving needles under her fingernails, then forcing her to eat the bloody fabric she tore from her own dress. Why the girl allegedly folded it wrong. Talk about high-stakes laundry. It's here that her taste for blood, metaphorical and literal, starts to congeal. Ferenc wasn't innocent either. His nickname, the Black Hero of Hungary, and not in a Marvel kind of way. He was feared on and off the battlefield. Known for his cruel streak, one disturbing rumor claims he taught Elizabeth how to roll oiled paper between servants' toes and set it alight for punishment. A weird bonding activity. But hey, some couples play cards. Historians still debate how complicit he really was in her darker acts. Some say he enabled her. Others claim he restrained her. But when he died in 1604, something changed. Elizabeth no longer had to share power or control, and she wasted no time claiming both. As you step out of the nursery and into a long corridor lined with arched windows, you can almost hear the rustle of silk skirts. The light outside is failing. Dusk bleeds into the hills. Shadows stretch. This is when, according to lore, the Countess came alive. You stop at one window. Below, a field once used to train soldiers now lies abandoned. Grass pokes through broken stone, but centuries ago, it might have been where young servant girls lined up each morning, hopeful for work, or maybe terrified they'd been summoned. Because inside these walls, Elizabeth wasn't just a lady of the house, she was something else, something darker. And the world outside had no idea what was unfolding one girl at a time. You move along the hallway, the cold pressing against your skin like damp breath. The castle's bones creak around you, and just ahead, a staircase coils downward into the private quarters, the part of the fortress Elizabeth called her own after Ferenc died. You descend carefully, one step at a time, feeling the stone smooth and shallow from centuries of footsteps, and some of those feet never came back up. Ferenc's death in 1604 marked a turning point. With her husband gone, Elizabeth inherited even more land and wealth, along with complete autonomy. No more shared rule, no more judgment, just a widow with too much power and too few people brave enough to tell her no. Outside the castle, she was a widow in mourning. Inside, a woman with servants, solitude, and seemingly no moral speed bumps. She moved between multiple estates, but Čachtice became her favorite. Isolated, perched high above the villages. It gave her the seclusion she craved and the privacy she required. You can almost hear her footsteps echoing through these same halls, trailing cold perfume and something far less floral. Here's where things get especially disturbing. Elizabeth didn't hunt strangers, at least not yet. She started small girls from the village, offered jobs as maids or companions. Nothing suspicious, just a noblewoman helping the poor. So kind, right, but they never came back. Historians still debate the role of her servants in these early disappearances. Some accounts say they were coerced. Others suggest they were gleeful participants. Either way, Elizabeth wasn't acting alone. She had help, and her household began to shift from domestic routine to something far more sinister. You step into her former dressing room. It's eerie how ordinary it looks. Shards of cracked mirror in the wall, a rusted brush on the vanity. But the energy here, tight, unsettled, like the room is holding its breath. In this space, she would have sat quietly while her hair was brushed, her gowns arranged, her face powdered, all while the screams from below, if there were screams, were muffled by a heavy stone and loyal staff. The village began to whisper. Girls who had once walked confidently up the hill to serve at Čachtice weren't seen again. Families were told their daughters had run off. Others were told they'd fallen ill. But mothers knew. They always do. One particularly grim story tells of a girl who managed to escape the castle, barefoot and bleeding, only to be returned by soldiers loyal to the countess. She was never seen again. Whether this is folklore or fact, we can't say for sure, but the legend clings to the stones like mildew. At this point in your little nighttime stroll, you may be wondering, why did no one stop her? Simple. She was nobility, and in 17th century Hungary, that meant something close to invincibility. The local authorities didn't dare accuse a woman of her status. If a peasant claimed a noble had committed a crime, that wasn't evidence, it was slander. So the rumors festered, and so did the body count. You pass a long corridor lined with wooden doors. Most are locked. One hangs open. Inside is a small room bare, except for a stool and a grate in the floor. Drainage, maybe, or punishment. Who knows? The line between utility and cruelty was pretty blurry back then. This is where Elizabeth's reputation began to shift. Her punishments turned ritualistic. She began experimenting, if that's the right word, with pain. Beatings, mutilations, and, according to some accounts, even biting. Yes, biting. One servant described watching the countess sink her teeth into a girl's cheek, ripping skin as if it were fruit. Was this a moment of rage or something else entirely? Historians still argue whether these were exaggerations, tales inflated by terrified villagers, or by political enemies. But the sheer number of overlapping testimonies suggests some kernel of truth. At least 300 girls are thought to have died under Elizabeth's care. Some records suggest far more. You walk further, and a familiar scent reaches your nose. Wax and old leather. You're in the armory now, or what's left of it. Hung above a stone arch are rusted shackles, each worn smooth at the cuffs. Nearby, a bench, a whip, and, oddly, a perfume bottle empty, but still faintly sweet. Lavender, maybe. Elizabeth, for all her cruelty, never abandoned her vanity. She dressed in silk, adorned herself in lace. She collected rare oils and powders luxuries from Venice and beyond. Some say she believed cleanliness and grace were outward signs of inner nobility. Others think it was a mask, a distraction from the nightmare she orchestrated beneath the elegance. Here, in her solitude, she became both lady and predator. The lines between punishment and pleasure began to dissolve. A fringe rumor whispered in only the oldest sources suggests she began journaling her experiments, documenting which punishments caused the most fear, which wounds produced the most blood. No such journal has ever been found. Maybe it's a myth, or maybe it's buried somewhere under the floor you're walking on. You reach a door with a heavy iron latch. Beyond it lies the staircase to the cellar. You hesitate because this next part, well, this is where things get messy. You push it open anyway. The cellar stairs groan under your weight just slightly, but enough to remind you that centuries of secrets have passed this way before. The air shifts, colder and wetter. A faint mineral tang hits your tongue, like rusted iron steeped in mildew. Your flashlight flickers once, as if reconsidering this entire idea. You keep going anyway. You reach the bottom, and the space opens up into a low, vaulted room. The ceiling is barely high enough to stand, and the walls drip with old moisture. Here's where the rumors start sharpening their teeth. This is where the servants were told not to go, where girls entered, and never walked back up those stairs. Welcome to the infamous ritual chamber, or at least, that's what later legends called it. Now, let's clear something up. There's no bloodstained bathtub sitting here waiting for tourists. Most of what you've heard about Elizabeth Bathory bathing in virgin blood came out during the investigation when witnesses were terrified. Torture was legal, and exaggerations ran rampant, but there's always a but. Several servants claimed she believed blood kept her young. One said she saw Elizabeth slap a servant girl across the face so hard it drew blood, then rub the blood into her own skin, watching her reflection in a hand mirror. That's the moment. Legend claims when something clicked, a new obsession, a new beauty routine. Historians still argue whether she genuinely believed blood had rejuvenating power, or whether it was symbolic punishment disguised as vanity. What's certain is this: the violence escalated. Girls were stripped, strung up, and bled slowly. One account says Elizabeth would walk beneath them, collecting the dripping blood in bowls. Another says she would smear it across her chest and face like a mask. It's gruesome. Yes, but more than that. It's ritualistic, controlled, methodical, and that makes it worse. Somehow, you walk the chamber's perimeter, noting shallow grooves in the stone floor, drainage lines, dark, reddish discoloration where fluid, let's not pretend it was wine, seeped over centuries. You pause at the center, where an iron hook still swings slightly overhead. Just movement in the air? Probably. There's a wooden table pushed into an alcove, its legs chewed by rats or time. On it, rusted implements, a branding iron, a pair of shears, what might once have been pincers. You'd like to think this was a blacksmith's workspace. You'd really like to think that. But then you find the comb. It's delicate, carved from ivory or bone, tiny teeth, finely spaced, a lady's item, a grooming tool, left here. And suddenly, the idea of this room as a ritual chamber doesn't seem so dramatic. It seems horrifyingly plausible. You sit on a nearby bench just for a moment and listen. No footsteps, no distant bells, but there's something in the silence. Not words exactly, just a pressure, like the stone is remembering. Elizabeth didn't act alone in these so-called rituals. She had help. Her closest associates included a wet nurse named Alona, a servant named Dorothea Sentes, and a dwarf courtier called Fichko. Yes, really, they acted as lures, punishers, even torturers in some accounts. A tiny entourage of terror. Why did they help? Maybe fear, maybe loyalty, maybe the simple thrill of power. One especially bizarre detail: Elizabeth allegedly kept a book listing every girl she killed, written in her own hand, with names, dates, and methods. The book was never found, but during her trial, one witness swore under oath that he saw it with over 600 names. That number alone, if true, would make her the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history. But let's pause on that for a second. 600. That's not a woman losing control. That's a woman with a system. And here, in this damp, awful chamber, the system lived. You brush dust off a stone shelf and find something strange. An iron ring embedded in the wall. A tether, maybe the kind you'd use to keep something from moving. Or just someone. A fringe theory says Elizabeth didn't just kill for beauty. She experimented. Tried to correct people she thought were imperfect. Cripples. The ill. The unattractive. Not just punishment, but purification. Again, this is disputed. Most modern historians agree the truth is a terrible blend of abuse, pathology, and power run wild. But even the most conservative accounts agree many girls died here, and it wasn't fast, or clean, or quiet. You find a corner blackened with old soot. Above it, the faint remains of a chimney. Was this used to cook burn evidence? Warm the room. One 17th century chronicler claimed Elizabeth burned girls with hot tongs. Another said she bit chunks from their shoulders like meat. Most dismissed that last part as lurid gossip. There's a dark joke in here somewhere, something about blood facials being trendy again. But here, in the silence of the cellar, even your mind doesn't want to laugh. You stand slowly, your joints ache from the cold. You glance once more at the table, the comb, the hook, and then you look up. Above you, just barely visible through the cracks of the wooden beams, is a faint stain on the ceiling, spread wide, dripped down, from above. From what room, you wonder, and you head toward the stairs because now you really want to know. The wooden stairs creak as you rise from the cellar slowly, quietly, as if afraid you'll disturb something best left forgotten. That faint stain on the ceiling still lingers in your mind. You don't want to think about what or who might have caused it, but you do. Of course you do. At the top of the staircase, a narrow door waits. It's warped with age. Iron latch rusted to a stubborn orange. You press it open with your shoulder, and a rush of colder air greets you dank, still, but heavier somehow. You've stepped into one of the private chambers where Elizabeth allegedly conducted her infamous beauty rituals. This room is different. Larger than you expected, almost ceremonial in shape. The walls are bare stone, with faded murals in the corners, something religious, maybe once comforting. Now, the paint is flaking and the face is smeared, like they tried to look away. You spot a large wooden tub in the corner, not ornate, not gilded, functional, but deep, too deep for a casual bath. And next to it, an overturned stool. You try not to imagine who sat on it last or what they were watching. This is where the rumors crystallize. The bath of blood, the famous tale that launched 1,000 horror films and Halloween costumes. Did she really bathe in the blood of virgins? Some say yes. Others call it metaphor, propaganda, or local legend spun into a myth by scandal and fear. Historians still argue whether the bathing story came from eyewitnesses or from terrified peasants seeking protection through exaggeration, but the imagery stuck, and for good reason. Nothing quite chills the spine like imagining a noblewoman reclining in warm, crimson liquid while candlelight dances off the walls. It's said Elizabeth believed the blood made her youthful again, that it softened wrinkles, brightened skin, gave her the vitality she feared was slipping with age. And considering she was nearing 40 when the killings intensified, perhaps desperation fed the madness. You walk to the tub. The wood is splintered, but intact. Inside, dark rings mark the interior age stains. Maybe, or maybe not. The shape is large enough to lie in, but not comfortably, not luxuriously. This wasn't a spa. This was a statement. And now here's the odd part, one that rarely makes the legends. Elizabeth didn't just use blood. According to some accounts, she also dabbled in homemade concoctions made of herbs, fat, and even powdered gemstones. One recipe involved crushing pearls into paste and applying it like a serum. Another animal marrow mixed with rose water. Honestly, you've probably seen worse on TikTok. The belief that blood had rejuvenating power wasn't unique to Elizabeth. In ancient Rome, gladiator blood was thought to cure epilepsy. In the Middle Ages, bloodletting was standard medical practice. And even today, there are expensive skincare treatments that involve plasma. So maybe Elizabeth was just an early adopter, with fewer moral boundaries and significantly more screaming. But back to the tub. One servant's testimony claimed that Elizabeth would laugh as the blood trickled from her victim's wounds into the basin, that she'd peer into a mirror and say she saw her youth returning, that the more pain inflicted, the better the results. Whether this is truth or fearful exaggeration, we'll never know. But it paints a picture of someone whose beauty regimen came at a horrifying cost. You glance around the room again. A small vanity rests near the window, its mirror long since cracked. You can just barely make out your reflection in the fragments. You look nervous, maybe a little pale. On the floor beside it, an iron bucket with a dented rim. More than one witness claimed Elizabeth had her attendants collect blood in these buckets strained through cloth, even as if she were refining it, filtering it, like wine. And speaking of wine, she drank that too, copiously. In fact, some records suggest she drank blood and wine mixed together. Again, That line between legend and reality blurs, but the theme is always the same: beauty through pain, youth through suffering, purity through blood. You notice something tucked into the corner, something easily missed. A length of silk ribbon, deep red, faded now, but tied into a loop. It could have been a hair accessory, or a keepsake, or something left behind by one of the countless girls who stepped into this room thinking they'd be serving tea, not serving as ingredients. You sit for a moment on the windowsill. The view is wide, peaceful. Rolling green hills stretch toward a sleepy village below, where the rooftops glow amber in the evening light. From up here, everything looks calm, simple, the perfect backdrop for nobility. It's easy to imagine how the illusion held for so long. Elizabeth threw lavish dinners. She hosted visiting aristocrats. She donated to churches. She wrote poetry. She even took in orphans, some of whom never made it back out. It was the perfect mask. And while the blood soaked deeper into the castle's floors, the world outside continued smiling. But behind this door, this very room, you can almost hear the soft swish of fabric, a sigh, a drop, a body hitting cold stone. One scholar once said that Čachtice Castle wasn't just a home, it was a hunger, fed by silence, stitched with obedience, and wrapped in velvet lies. You believe it now. You stand, giving the tub one last glance. You try not to picture the waterline. You try not to picture her in it. You fail, and then, without another word, you leave the room and shut the door behind you. You walk slowly now, not just from the chill, but from the growing weight of what you've seen. The castle doesn't feel like stone anymore. It feels like skin, like every corridor is a vein, every door a bone joint, and you've been traveling through a body that's long dead, but not empty. As you step back into the main hallway, the light flickers from a distant torch bracket, reminding you Elizabeth didn't act alone, and what she did wasn't hidden. Not really. It was managed, maintained, polished like silverware. She had a team, a loyal, twisted inner circle that kept the machine humming. The first was Ilona Jo, her former wet nurse, sweet, nurturing until you handed her a hot iron and a girl who forgot to bow. Then there was Dorotya Zentes, the housekeeper with a backbone of steel and a moral compass that spun in any direction Elizabeth pointed. And of course, Fichko, the court dwarf, treated like a pet in public and a participant in private. His small stature made him less threatening, which made him perfect for jobs that required slipping through shadows. Together, they ran the castle like a factory. And the product: blood, pain, silence. You pass the side chamber now. Inside, faded paintings of noble ancestors hang crooked on the walls, their eyes staring just a little too hard. You swear one of them is Elizabeth's cousin, Gabor Bathory, a prince of Transylvania with ambitions that never quite outpaced his debts. He died young, poisoned. The Bathory family had a habit of dying suspiciously, and yet Elizabeth endured for decades. Historians still debate how much her staff knew, whether they were scared into complicity or active participants. But what's clear is this: the house didn't run itself. Girls had to be acquired, bodies had to be buried, blood had to be cleaned. No single person could manage all that without a structure. In fact, the way victims were recruited is one of the more chilling details. Elizabeth allegedly sent letters to rural families, offering work to their daughters as handmaidens, service to the countess. The letters promised decent pay, good food, a noble reference for poor peasants. This was the medieval equivalent of landing a government job. You packed your daughter's best dress and kissed her goodbye. She didn't come back. You walk past what might have been the servants' quarters, narrow beds, cold floors, one iron stove that could never have kept the whole room warm. Did they hear the screams? Did they know what happened behind the doors they were forbidden to open? Maybe they did. But here's the thing: servants who asked too many questions had a habit of falling ill. One servant, Anna was rumored to have tried escaping after witnessing a punishment gone too far. She disappeared. Elizabeth claimed she ran away. Locals said they found her body folded inside a wine barrel, arms snapped like twigs. It's unconfirmed, but the rumor spread like fire, and no one else ever ran. Even the village priest suspected something. He confronted Elizabeth once in writing, urging her to confess, to seek forgiveness. She ignored him, of course, but the letter still exists. His tone was cautious, almost frightened. Even a man of God feared what she might do if pushed too hard. Back in the castle, her staff moved like clockwork. When one girl died, another was brought in. The injured were hidden. The dead were buried or burned. In some cases, fed to the dogs. There's one surviving account that Elizabeth kept a pack of large hunting dogs trained to respond only to her voice. One barked when it smelled blood. One never barked at all. You take a turn down a hallway lined with narrow doors, storerooms. Some still hold rusted hooks, ropes, heavy bolts, not military equipment. These weren't used in defense, they were used in discipline. The castle's resources were repurposed from war to whatever this was. One scholar referred to Čachtice as a small empire of terror, not because it held armies, but because it had bureaucracy. Orders were written, tasks were assigned, people disappeared, and the paperwork was always clean. There were ledgers, records, even meal plans. Just none for the missing. A strange, lesser-known detail, Elizabeth insisted that any cloth used to mop up blood be burned immediately. Not washed, not reused, burned. Some say this was to avoid evidence. Others claim she believed it was spiritually necessary, that blood should never be recycled. You wonder if she ever thought the same about people. You stop at a locked door, heavy, iron-bound, with no key in sight. Behind it, legend says, was a storage room for girls who were injured, but not yet dead. A grotesque halfway point between punishment and disposal. Witnesses later described hearing moans through the walls. Others claim the room was silent, terrifyingly so. Historians still argue whether this storage room ever existed, but survivors, those rare few, described Elizabeth's eyes lighting up at the sight of fresh blood, her voice calm and gentle even as she ordered disfigurements, as if she were choosing flower arrangements or folding napkins. And through it all, her household ran smoothly, dinners were served, guests were entertained, letters were sent, no chaos, just routine, just elegance, wrapped tightly around rot. You look back at the hallway. For a moment, you imagine being a servant here, waking before dawn, preparing tea, cleaning the walls, knowing what happened the night before, and pretending nothing had changed. Because in Čachtice Castle, the screams stopped, but the Countess always smiled. You leave the corridor of locked doors and climb a narrow stone stairwell, the kind designed more for secrecy than comfort. Each step feels like an intrusion, like you're trespassing through a story that's trying to stay buried. You emerge into a long hall lined with the narrow windows. The moonlight outside casts silver lines across the floor, straight, perfect, prison-like, somehow fitting. This was the part of the castle reserved for reflection, for reading, for prayer, or so the original plan said. But here, you feel the shift, the point where even Elizabeth's dark world began to spiral beyond her control. It started slowly, a maid beaten too harshly, a death that wasn't clean, whispers of bodies hidden in shallow graves, not quite buried deep enough. The stories reached the ears of neighboring nobles, and eventually, even the Habsburg court. Not everyone was willing to stay quiet anymore. But what's haunting is that even as the violence escalated, Elizabeth didn't hide it better. She flaunted it. She stopped selecting only peasant girls and began targeting daughters of minor nobility. That was her mistake. When peasants disappeared, the silence was cheap, But when noble blood vanished, it made noise. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth lost her grip on caution or whether, by then, she simply thought herself untouchable. Maybe it was grief over Ference. Maybe it was madness. Maybe, as one scholar suggested, she believed she was enacting divine justice, cleansing the sinful, purifying the weak. Whatever the reason, her actions became louder, more public, and far more brutal. One account details how a girl was forced to strip in the courtyard during winter, doused with water until she froze solid. A human statue. Elizabeth reportedly watched with curiosity, then ordered her shattered with a staff. There's no way to know if it's true, but it's been repeated for 400 years. You open the door to a small room, the chapel. It's quiet, undisturbed. A few pews remain, a crumbling altar, the smell of wax long burned away. You notice something scratched into the wood initials. Some old, some recent. One reads E.B., just those two letters. But in this space, they feel heavy. They say Elizabeth would come here after her worst punishments, that she would kneel, not to repent, but to compose herself, to feel centered again, balanced. One witness later claimed they saw her whispering prayers with blood still wet on her sleeves. Whether those prayers were for forgiveness or something far more personal is anyone's guess. And then, of course, there were the guests. It's easy to forget, but Čachtice wasn't just a dungeon with curtains. It was a noble estate. There were visitors, parties, performances, diplomats and courtiers sipping wine in the very halls where bodies cooled hours earlier. Imagine entertaining guests in the same rooms where girls were bled dry. Imagine toasting to good health as servants scrubbed dark stains from beneath the tables. That's the horror of Elizabeth Bathory. Her cruelty didn't happen in the shadows. It walked in heels across polished floors and smiled at strangers. One strange rumor, less famous, but persistent claims she kept a pet raven that mimicked screams, that it would call out in a child's voice at odd hours. Most dismiss it as poetic invention, but once you hear that detail, it sticks in your brain like a splinter. And here's something colder still toward the end. Elizabeth began to act theatrical. According to one servant, she began wearing only black velvet, her hair powdered ghost pale, her fingers ringed in dark stones. She'd descend into the lower chambers in silence, her heels clicking once for every footstep a girl made trying to flee. The Countess, it seems, had started to embrace her own legend, but so had the townspeople. By now, they were afraid, angry, and beginning to organize. Parents started hiding their daughters. Roads leading to Čachtice became suspiciously quiet, and nobles once amused by the gossip began to collect testimonies. And yet, inside the castle, Elizabeth continued, like a clockwork doll programmed only for control, ritual, and routine. If she noticed the world tightening around her, she gave no sign. But others did. Fichko grew erratic. Alona reportedly turned to drink. Dorothea began sneaking letters to relatives, maybe sensing that the end was near. Because it was. You reach another room, tucked behind the chapel, smaller, personal. A writing desk sits in the corner, its surface warped by time and damp. There's a drawer, stuck halfway open, and inside, an old ribbon and a wax seal. You can almost picture Elizabeth here, pen in hand, composing invitations or orders or cover stories. It's easy to imagine her writing something mundane, a dinner menu, a supply list, a message to her cousin asking for more rose oil, and right beneath it, a request for more rope, more lime, more girls. This was the tipping point. The deaths were piling too high, the stories too gruesome. Elizabeth no longer controlled the narrative, and those who once turned a blind eye were now sharpening their gaze. Still, she kept going. You move back into the hall and glance toward the end where a window glows faintly. Outside, the wind has picked up, and the trees bend as if whispering to each other. The Countess didn't stop, couldn't stop, or maybe she didn't want to, because in her mind, perhaps, she was no longer killing. She was perfecting. You follow the long corridor to its very end, where the light fades entirely. There's a narrow door smaller than the others, with a heavy latch and deep scratches around the frame, like something was dragged through too many times. You hesitate, because you know what this is, or what it was. Not a torture room, not a chamber of ritual, something worse, in a way. This is where the truth started coming out. In 1610, it all finally unraveled. King Matthias II, hearing louder and louder rumors, commissioned an investigation. The man chosen to lead it, Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, a powerful noble and distant relative of Elizabeth herself. A choice that was convenient, political, safe. Historians still argue whether Thurzo came seeking justice or just a way to quietly neutralize a very problematic woman of power. Either way, he gathered sworn testimonies from over 300 witnesses' servants, villagers, even local clergy, and what they said, it chilled the court. Stories of girls hanging from rafters, girls burned with irons, girls covered in honey and left for insects, girls sewn into horse corpses, girls buried beneath kitchen floors, and always, always, Elizabeth at the center, composed and commanding. Like a maestro of pain, Thurzo arrived at Čachtice unannounced, just after Christmas in 1610. You step inside the room now. It's nearly empty, but your eyes catch what looks like a notch in the stone, a groove, worn in a wide arc, like a door once swung here, or a gate, or a cage. According to later accounts, Thurzo and his men entered the castle that night and caught Elizabeth in the act. The details vary. Some say she was mid-punishment. Others say she was merely dressing a wound. A few claim there was a dead girl on the floor, her body still warm. The official records are deliberately vague. What we do know is this 4 of Elizabeth's closest servants were immediately arrested: Ilona, Dorothea, Fichko, and another maid named Katerina. All were tortured and interrogated. All confessed, in gruesome detail, and not just to what they had seen, but to what they had done. One claimed Elizabeth forced her to hold down a screaming girl while she was branded. Another said she watched the Countess bite through a girl's shoulder blade and laugh. But here's where it gets stranger. Elizabeth herself was never put on trial. Not once. The others were. They were tried, condemned, and executed publicly. Ilona and Dorothea had their fingers torn out before being burned alive. Fichko was beheaded. Katerina, the youngest and most reluctant participant, was spared death but imprisoned for life. But Elizabeth, she was too well connected, too noble, and maybe too dangerous. You walk across the room, your steps echoing oddly off the low ceiling. This was once the great hall, where nobles met and judgments were whispered behind wine. The table's gone, but you can picture the scene. Thurzo, stern-faced, laying out the accusations. Elizabeth, silent. Her expression unreadable. Maybe she saw it coming. Maybe she didn't care. Instead of trial, she was sentenced by royal decree. No defense, no formal charges, just sealed away. You walk through an archway, ducking slightly, and arrive at the stairwell to her final chamber. It's narrow, crumbling. Each step feels heavier than the last. At the bottom, the room opens bare stone, no windows, just 4 walls, a bed, a slot in the door for food. This was her prison, sealed inside in 1610. Elizabeth Bathory, once one of the most powerful women in Europe, was walled into her own castle. Literally. Bricks placed across the doorway, a single slit for water and bread. No visitors, no trials, No voice. Imagine that. You sit on the cold ledge beside the wall. You run your fingers over the rough mortar. The silence here isn't peaceful. It's suffocating, and it's filled with questions. Did she think she deserved this? Did she think she'd ever get out? Did she count the days or forget time entirely? It said she wrote letters while in prison, many, pleading for mercy, proclaiming innocence, even blaming others. None were answered, none were kept. If any exist, they've been lost to time. She died 4 years later, alone, in total darkness. One morning, a guard peeked through the slot and found her lying still, facing the wall. No witnesses, no last words, no ceremony, just gone. Buried in an unmarked grave, possibly under the castle chapel, or maybe not. Some say her body was moved, quietly, to avoid desecration. Others say she never died, just faded into myth, wandering her castle forever, her footsteps trailing blood no one can clean. Historians still argue what really happened that night of her arrest, whether the accusations were exaggerated, whether the victims were counted accurately, whether Elizabeth was guilty or simply inconvenient. But inside this room, none of that matters, because you feel it, the absence, the final stillness of a life that spun wildly out of control and then was bricked up and forgotten. You rise, slowly, carefully. You leave the room behind and walk back into the corridor. The air feels lighter now. Not better, just emptier, as if the castle has let go of one long-held breath. The corridor stretches behind you like the closing chapter of a long, terrible book. The stone underfoot no longer creaks, it exhales. And though you've traced nearly every corner of Čachtice Castle, from its perfume chambers to its darkest cellars, one final space calls to you. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet. Too quiet. You find it in the west wing, tucked behind a bricked arch. The doorway is narrow, barely wide enough for your shoulders. You duck through and enter a cold, undecorated room, just stone, dust, and silence. A single slab rests in the floor, no plaque, no flowers, no inscription, just blank stone, like a full stop at the end of a long and monstrous sentence. This, some believe, is Elizabeth Bathory's grave. Others disagree. The truth is, no one knows where her body ended up. Some records say she was buried in the family crypt beneath the castle chapel. Others claim her relatives, fearing her remains might be desecrated, moved her in secret to her birthplace in Exed. And of course, the legends go further. Some say the villagers dug her up in secret and burned her body to purge the land. Historians still debate what happened to her corpse, whether it was buried in shame, protected in reverence, or quietly erased. But the fact that we're still wondering 400 years later, that her physical absence still echoes, says something about the hold she has on us. You kneel beside the stone. The air here is heavier, like it's waiting for someone to speak. You run your hand along the cold surface. It's smooth, almost worn, as if touched by centuries of uncertain pilgrims, each asking the same question you are. Was it all true? Was Elizabeth Bathory really the monstrous blood countess who killed hundreds of girls for youth, beauty, or sadistic pleasure? Or was she the victim of politics, slander, and greed, a powerful widow whose enemies grew sharper than her crimes? The official tally of victims, as recorded in court testimonies, reached 650, an impossible number, perhaps, or a chillingly accurate one. Servants confessed under torture, peasants whispered through sobs. Names were listed in a ledger that no longer exists. But we do know girls disappeared. We know witnesses saw blood, broken bodies, cages. We know her household staff were executed for crimes they described in detail. And we know she was never brought to trial because her noble blood protected her. That tension between what we can prove and what we believe is what keeps her story alive. You stand slowly, brushing dust from your hands. The room hasn't changed. It offers no secrets, no revelations, just the same blank stone. And yet, you feel watched. Not in a threatening way, but like history itself is holding its breath, waiting for you to decide what you think. Outside the windowless chamber, Čachtice Castle feels strangely hollow. The draft down the hallway isn't just cold, it's empty. The grandeur is gone, the terror faded, and yet her shadow stretches longer than ever. In books, in horror films, in Halloween costumes. Elizabeth Bathory, the woman, the myth, the monster has outlived her own bones. She's been called the female Dracula, the first vampire, a queen of death. But she was also a real woman, educated, fluent, political. She governed vast lands, exchanged letters with nobility, and ran her estate with ruthless efficiency, all while possibly committing some of the most horrific acts ever attributed to a single person. And that's what unsettles you most. Not the blood, not the screams, but the way she blended in. She wore lace. She said prayers, she entertained guests, and then she killed, not in chaos, but in routine, not in rage, but in ritual. The worst monsters, perhaps, are the ones who look exactly like nobility. You glance one last time at the floorstone, no movement, no whisper, just silence. Then you step out, closing the door behind you with a soft click, and still somewhere in the stone, she lingers. You move through the dim halls with slower steps now, not from exhaustion, but something heavier, something quieter. The castle doesn't resist your presence anymore. It accepts it, like it knows you've seen enough, or maybe like you've become part of its memory. You descend one final staircase, this time toward the main entrance, not the grand one Elizabeth once used to greet nobles, but the side path servants once slipped through with downcast eyes and broken shoes. It's cracked and uneven now. Moss grows between the stones, but the path feels truer somehow, more honest. As you reach the outer corridor, moonlight spills through the narrow windows. It streaks across the floor like pale fingers. You glance back once. Instinctively, the halls are still. The silence holds. Centuries have passed since Elizabeth Bathory last walked these floors, but her presence clings like perfume sweet, powdery, and wrong. You've seen where she lived, where she ruled, where she was sealed away, and maybe, if the stories are even half true, where she bathed in blood. But now comes the harder part, deciding who she really was. History has never quite agreed. Was she a predator? A scapegoat? A woman driven mad by loss, power, or inherited cruelty? Or was she all of those things layered like silk gowns, hiding iron hooks? Some say the case against her was political, that the king, deeply in debt to the Bathory family, used the rumors as an excuse to confiscate her lands, that Thurzo, her arresting cousin, orchestrated the trial to preserve noble dignity without stirring public outrage. It's possible, but then there are the testimonies, 300 of them, many matching in detail, many too graphic to dismiss, servants describing screams behind doors, villagers speaking of daughters who never returned, a castle designed not just for nobility, but for silence, for hiding. You pass the chapel as you walk. Its doors are closed now. Dust covers the threshold. Inside, she may be buried, or not. But even if her body's gone, the weight of her name remains. Elizabeth. It sounds soft, regal, elegant, not like a monster at all. And yet, here we are 400 years later, still talking about her, still wondering what parts were real, still flinching at the idea of beauty built on pain. There's a strange modern irony in it. Today, beauty is sold in jars and serums and needles. Anti-aging is an industry, polished and sterile, but at its heart, the fear is the same, the fear of fading, of being forgotten, of power slipping through wrinkled hands. Elizabeth, for all her horror, gave us a metaphor made of blood. She didn't just want to stay young, she wanted to stay in control, and when that slipped, so did she. You step into the castle courtyard now, where the grass is overgrown and the walls crumble gently into the hills. The night is calm, a breeze stirs the trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird shifts in its sleep. You breathe in. The air is sharp and clean and still laced with history. You feel it in your lungs, in your shoulders, in your shoes, as if something followed you out. You pause at the outer gate. Turning back once more, the silhouette of the castle stands against the night sky, black and jagged, like a tooth broken off at the root. She's still in there, you think. Not her body, not her soul, her story. And it's not done telling itself. And now, as the wind softens and the night deepens, we gently step back from Čachtice. The castle grows smaller in the distance, its shadow no longer looming but lingering, like the last note of a long-forgotten song. You exhale slowly, shoulders loosening, heart steady again. The footsteps fade, the blood dries, the mirror fogs and goes dark. Whatever Elizabeth Bathory really was, monster, martyr, or myth, she belongs now to the pages of time. The stone walls remain, the legends remain, but your part in the story has ended. For tonight, at least, you return to the present, to the quiet comfort of your room, the low hum of the fan in the background, the softness of your pillow waiting just behind your thoughts, the weight of your blanket grounding you to something safe, familiar, undisturbed. Let the flicker of candlelight fade. Let the moon slip behind the clouds. Let the past return to sleep. You've walked through centuries tonight, stepped across blood-soaked legends, whispered in rooms no longer echoing, and stared into the eyes of one of history's most terrifying women. But you made it out. Not everyone did. And now your eyes are heavy. Your breath slower. The shadows harmless. You're safe. Good night, traveler. Rest easy. Elizabeth won't follow you. She never leaves the castle.